The storm announced itself long before it broke, with a sky the color of hammered pewter and a wind that combed the high plains flat, lifting dust from the sage and sending it in low, restless skeins across the open. Early spring on the Wyoming steppe was never gentle. It could tease you with a morning of bright cold sun and then swallow the light by noon, replacing it with a long wall of cloud crawling down from the snow lines. On that day, the cloud wall came with a low growl, the kind that makes animals look up before people do. A scattered band of pronghorn stopped mid-stride and turned as one. A red-tail hawk clung to a fence-line post, feathers pressed tight. Even the ravens shut up and angled inland. The land held its breath, and in that hush moved a small, dark chestnut Mustang mare, and the new life pressed to her side. The mare, Willow, carried her month-old colt like a promise at her hip. Phoenix was bright bay with a tiny, star-shaped crest of white centered on his forehead, a little badge that caught light when the sun slanted right. He still had the choppy steps of a youngster, big-eyed and unsure. But the plains had already written some confidence into him. He matched his mother's stride because that felt like safety. He drank when she drank, rested when she rested, lifted his head when she paused to listen, and learned, instinct by instinct, what the wind said. The wind today said hurry. It came thin at first, then in surges, carrying the smell of turned earth and the sharp metal edge of rain. Willow angled toward a low basin where sage grew thicker and the scatter of greasewood formed a rough shield. Out on the open flats you could see a storm coming a county away, but in the basins you could duck the first of the blows. She was a mare who had seen winters, who had learned the shape of dry gullies and the way mud holds a hoof, who knew to seek the slow slopes rather than the steep. Phoenix followed, nose brushing her flank as the first cold drops hit and stung. Rain, when it finally came like a decision. It ramped from pinpricks to steady drumming in less than a minute, then to sheets that crossed the plains at a slant, visible lines marching. The low places took it first. The basins that had been brushed smooth by wind became shallow saucers of moving water, then bowls collecting it, then traps. Willow stepped down the basin's gentle lip. Her hooves sank an inch, then two, into the spring-softened soil. Phoenix tested the ground and flicked his tail, surprised by the way the earth gave. He stayed with her, as he always did, body angling to the curve of her ribs. They pushed deeper, looking for the pocket where mesquite and sage might lean together enough to break the wind. The sky flickered white and the thunder arrived a breath later, running low along the ground. Willow paused, ears pricked forward and back, doing the arithmetic of storm and shelter. She shifted left, then right. Phoenix copied her small movements, learning without names. The rain thickened. Water gathered and ran down the slope behind them, turning the top layer of earth into slick, dark paste. The first misstep didn't seem like a misstep at all. Willow lifted, set, and the ground accepted her hoof and did not fully release it. She eased back, and there was the soft, stomach-deep sound of suction. Phoenix's ears shot forward. He hopped sideways and found a patch that held. Willow tried again, shifting weight to free the trapped foreleg, and the second hoof sank deeper. The basin's bottom had been baked by sun, then cracked by freeze, and now the rain was finding those seams, inflating them with slick. She blew out and tested a different angle. The mud answered by taking more of her. Phoenix could have turned up the slope behind them and scrambled out. It was narrow and canted, but solid enough a light colt could skid her up, hooves ticking on roots and rock. He moved toward it instinctively, front legs braced, hindquarters bunched, a single sharp bound from safety. Willow's flanks tightened as she set herself for another pull, and, without thinking, without any thought except the one that had defined every hour of his short life, Phoenix changed direction and returned to the warmth of her side. He pressed his shoulder into her, sensing the tremor in her body and answering it with contact. Thunder walked the sky again. The rain came harder, fat drops smashing into mud and breaking it down further. The mud wasn't uniform. It made ridges, pockets, and windows where sand floated and clay lay beneath. Willow found one of the bad places. She shifted, tried to rise, and the ground held her like a hand around the pastern. She inhaled and lowered again, conserving energy, and Phoenix mirrored that, dipping his head and blinking against the rain that crusted his eyelashes in wet spikes. His small hooves were light, so the earth gave and released them with sticky kisses. He could move. He didn't. Willow turned an ear back and nudged him with her muzzle, a soft correction that said, "Keep your balance. Keep your head up. Breathe." The basin changed around them in minutes. Water pooled and sought the low point, crowding in shallow streams that found Willow's legs and pushed around them, leaving eddies of brown bubbles, sage tips bent until they lay flat, and then rose again, shivering. A jackrabbit broke cover and sprinted along the rim, ears hammered back, feet throwing tiny bursts of mud. The thunder grew teeth. Lightning stitched a jagged line between cloud and ridge, so close the light hurt. Phoenix flinched and instant returned to his lean against Willow's ribs. The plains didn't care. They didn't care about mothers and sons or the clean drama of survival. They didn't care that the mare had kept herself scarce around people, that she'd made it through a winter thin but whole, that she'd foaled late and cleverly, in a cutbank under a cottonwood that kept the wind off just enough. The plains worked in the math of water and slope, of gravity and habit. Water moved downhill. Mud deepened where hooves churned it. The basin took what it was offered and made more of it. Willow knew this in the way a horse knows the shape of a predator's shadow without needing to name it. She shifted her weight backward, trying to float her forelegs free, a tiny release, then the left sank again. She tried the right, found purchase for a heartbeat, and then it went down to the knee. Her breath shortened. She paused longer between attempts, head low, nostrils flaring as she kept the scent of her colt close. Phoenix rested his chin on her withers for a moment, then stepped out and back in again, unsure what gesture to make when the world itself was the problem. Far off, over the curve of the land, the dark stamp of a truck moved along a ranch road, too distant to mean anything yet. Closer, the hawk relinquished its post and let the wind carry it downwind in a long, controlled glide. The rain cooled another few degrees, that particular bitter chill that says the storm is layering and will have more to give. The basin's edges began to slump. The narrow exit where Phoenix could have leaped to safety thinned as runnels of water licked away the better grips. Willow tried again. And this time the effort was all in, shoulder muscles roping, hindquarters working, the long line of her spine flattening as she threw her weight back and up. For a second she rose, lifted, flesh separating from the sucking earth, hope like a spark in the constant gray. Then the front hoof slid, found deeper purchase where there shouldn't have been any, and she sank to the chest with a wet, heavy sound that stole breath. Phoenix squeaked and danced and came closer, searching her eyes as if answers lived there. On a small rise beyond the basin, where the sage offered a little higher ground and the wind hit clean, A woman stood with her hood cinched tight, watching the way the rain laid lines across the land. Claire Donovan had learned to read this country with the respect of a student who knows the test never ends. Outside Rawlins, on a patch of dirt and grass stitched together by stubbornness and fencing, she kept a rescue ranch alive year to year with sweat, odd jobs, and a scatter of checks that always arrived later than the bills. She had chores stacked in her head, hay yet to stack in the loft, a gelding with a cough she didn't like, and a coffee she'd meant to drink hot that had long since gone cold. None of that mattered as much as the tilt of the sky and the way storms made traps out of places that looked kind in the calm. She brought the binoculars up and panned the basin. She didn't need the glass to know what the shapes were, but it helped to see detail. Chestnut mare, young, in trouble. Bright bay foal with a star, pressed in close like a lantern's flame guarded by a cupped hand. The rain blurred them and sharpened them in alternating breaths. Claire tracked the slope above them and the exits below. All the small math problems she'd solve better up close. The wind pushed at her shoulder. She lowered the binoculars and touched the radio clipped to her jacket, thumb finding the transmit button by memory. The storm was still building. The basin was filling, and in the middle of it, a mother and her colt stood against a land that didn't know their names. The storm had passed only hours ago, leaving the air heavy with that metallic scent of wet earth and the faint tang of ozone. Claire Donovan was in her barn, the old tin roof ticking as it cooled, feeding the last of the rescue horses their evening hay. She moved methodically, tossing flakes into each stall, the rhythmic thud of hooves and soft snorts filling the quiet space. The chores had become second nature. Stack hay, check water, run a quick hand down a withers to feel for heat or swelling. Outside, the puddles in the ranch yard mirrored a low, churning sky. The crackle of her barn radio broke the calm. She set down the pitchfork, wiping her hands on her jeans before grabbing the handset. The voice on the other end was roughened by static but unmistakable. Rick Turner, a ranch hand from the neighboring spread. "Claire, you still on Channel 6? You might want to hear this. Spotted a mare and foal in a bad way during the storm. Down in one of the south basins. Mud's deep, real deep." Claire's eyes went to the dark horizon. "How bad?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Chest deep for the mare. Colt sticking close. Don't know how long they've been in there." The wind on Rick's end swallowed the rest, but the urgency was clear. She replaced the radio in its cradle and crossed to the small desk in the corner of the barn, where her weather radar sat on an old laptop. The screen glowed pale blue and green, with an ominous yellow blotch sweeping in from the west. Another storm cell, moving faster than she liked. Estimated time to impact. 2 hours, maybe less if the wind kept pushing it. Her jaw tightened. That wasn't much time. She stepped into action without hesitation. The old pickup, parked nose first by the tack shed, was a stubborn beast, but she knew its moods. She backed it to the small horse trailer with practiced ease, the hitch clanking into place. The trailer's gate squeaked as she checked the latch, making sure it would hold steady over rough ground. Inside the barn, she grabbed what she knew she might need. Coiled ropes and nylon harnesses went into a battered duffel, followed by a set of portable corral panels she could rig into makeshift barriers if the foal bolted. Her medical kit, stocked with antiseptic, wraps, and syringes, was zipped shut and slung over her shoulder. 2 wool blankets went in next, their familiar weight a comfort against the cold she knew she'd face out there. She paused, her hand brushing the worn leather of her gloves, and for a moment, the smell of damp hay and horse sweat brought back memories of other rescues. Some had ended in relief, the animal walking, stumbling but alive, onto her trailer. Others, she pushed the thought aside, but not before the image of a young bay mare from 3 winters ago slid into focus. Her head heavy in Claire's lap as the snow covered her still body. That one had stayed with her. The pickup's engine coughed to life, diesel grumble filling the yard. Claire swung the duffel into the passenger seat, climbed in, and pulled out onto the dirt road that led toward the Turner place. Mud sprayed from her tires in wet arcs. The land rolled away on either side, sagebrush shimmering with trapped rain, cattle scattered in the distance, their hides slick and darkened. A thin veil of mist clung low in the hollows, blurring the line where ground met sky. Every minute counted now. The basin Rick mentioned was known for catching runoff. The clay there could grab a hoof like a fist and not let go. She knew that terrain, flat-looking from a distance, but treacherous when the storms came. If the mare was chest-deep already, the next downpour could take away her last chance. As she drove, the wipers fought the beginnings of a new drizzle, each sweep smearing the world into gray streaks. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, her mind running through the steps ahead. Approach slow, avoid spooking the foal, test the mud before committing weight, keep the ropes high to stay clear of suction. The sky to the west was a shade darker now, a bruise spreading. The storm wasn't waiting. Neither could she. Claire eased the truck to a stop on higher ground and let the engine idle down to a tick. The basin lay ahead, like a shallow bowl poured into the plains, its edges softened by rain and cut with small runnels that still carried water. The light had that odd, strained quality storms leave behind, a mix of flat gray and nickel-bright flashes where puddles mirrored the sky. Wind combed the sage into a single direction, then lost interest and let it spring back. She took the binoculars from the dash and brought the glass up, bracing her elbows on the steering wheel to kill the tremor the cold put in her hands. There they were, exactly where Rick said they'd be. A dark chestnut mare, sunk to the chest, shoulder girdle laboring in small, controlled surges that made almost no difference. A bright bay foal with a white star pressed close as a shadow. His narrow body tilted into the curve of her ribs, like he could hold her up by will alone. The colt's head lifted when the wind changed, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of truck, human, oil, leather, rain. He didn't bolt. He didn't even step away. He stayed because staying was the idea that ran his whole world. Claire lowered the glass and felt the storm behind her shoulder. To the west, the cloud shelf thickened, gathering its hem. The radar's 2-hour estimate had already felt generous. Up here, time sped up when weather had work to do. She slid out of the cab, shoulders hunched out of habit against the gust that searched for any gap in a jacket and found it. The first drop struck her cheek with a small, cold slap. Then another. Drizzle, not yet the hammering kind, but the air had the metallic taste that preceded hard rain. She didn't slam the door. She set it shut with the quiet hand of someone who had learned what noises carry across an open. The duffel went over one shoulder. A pair of light portable panels leaned against the trailer wall. She took one in each hand by the cutouts, testing their balance, judging how far she could get before the mud demanded more of her legs than her arms could spare. Ropes looped across her torso from shoulder to hip, coiled neat so they would pay out clean. The med kit, smaller but heavy with choices, settled at her hip. The path in was not direct. The basin sloped like a diagram, what looked like the shortest path cut across the darkest slick. She scanned for the pale streaks where sand floated under thin water, for the scuffed tongues of clay that would seize anything heavier than a jackrabbit. The rims held their shape in most places, but 2 notches had slumped where water had gnawed at them. She angled for a shoulder with grass still standing, the blades rattling with grit and dropping beads of water when the wind shook them. Her first footfall on the slope sank past the tread. The ground took her weight, considered it, and returned it grudgingly. She set the panels down and tested again, heel first, then toe. The mud gave with a soft kiss sound and let go. That would change when it filled. She marked that in her head and moved, slow and steady, the duffel's strap cutting into her collarbone. Closer, the sounds changed shape. The wind's voice was lower, carrying the drum of distant thunder like a rumble underfoot. Water ticked in tiny taps as it collected in grass heads and let go. Beneath that, the mare's breath came in measured bursts, not panic fast, but edging toward that line where the body's efficient math begins to fall apart. Phoenix's smaller lungs made a lighter rhythm, out of sync in the way a young animal is, trying to mirror and not quite matching. He saw her before the mare turned her ear. His head lifted as if tugged by a string. He pivoted his ears to find the new shape in the world. He didn't blow or stamp. He set his hooves and watched, wide-eyed, the star on his forehead blinking as raindrops struck and ran in bright paths. Claire dropped her chin, made herself smaller, a moving shape that meant no chase. She kept her hands low and empty where he could see them, fingers spread so the gloves showed as hands and not tools. Her breath came slow on purpose. Animals learned from whatever a body around them announced, and she wanted to announce steady. Willow turned then, the near ear flicking to the new sound. She kept her head low, not in submission but conservation, every degree of lift costing effort. Her nostrils widened. Her eyes, one visible under the heavy forelock slapped wet against her face, tracked Claire's shoulder. The mare's breathing hitched, then returned to its count. Claire stopped moving before they asked her to. Distance mattered at this stage. Trust was a circle drawn by the least comfortable being in it. The mud around Willow had a different color than the mud a step away. It was darker where it had been churned by tries, the water pooling on top slick and glossy, bubbles popping in slow, viscous blips. Her forelegs disappeared past the knee into that, and every exhale sank her an imperceptible hair. Her hindquarters still had leverage, but the angle was wrong. Any backward surge risked losing what purchase she had. Any forward push demanded a depth she didn't have. The mare had found the math and was waiting between problems for the solution to present itself from outside her. Claire set one panel down on the slope, then the other, edges kissing to form a shallow V she could brace against if the ground thought about taking her, too. She slid the duffel off and unzipped it with careful fingers. Rope, a short, soft line, a longer, stiffer one with a half splice. A loop she could run up the cannon bone without crushing tissue if Willow let her get that close. She didn't reach yet. She let the gear's presence be a silent promise. The drizzle thickened. The wind brought the smell of the next squall, colder, with a bite like water fresh out of snowmelt. Claire's hood tugged and flapped. She pulled it tighter, not for comfort but to keep the edges out of her eyes. Phoenix shifted his weight, took one small step away, then returned to his exact place, shoulder against Willow's ribs, the place that was his entire idea of home. His trust wasn't naive. It was practiced, It had been rewarded every hour of his short life, and now it kept him in the most dangerous spot in the basin. Claire noted the exit points again, the higher tongue of ground behind and to the left where a foal's light hooves could still tick up to safety. She marked it to use when the time came and let the thought go for now. First steps first. Spook the foal and he would scramble, split him from the mare and he might return badly, find the wrong slick, crowd her at the wrong angle, take them both down that last inch they could not afford. Keep the circle calm. Keep the air steady. She dragged one panel another foot closer, then sank a knee into the mud to drop her center of gravity. The cold bit through denim and found bone. Her glove slid under the surface water and met the thicker drag below. She touched the mud's edge with the flat of her palm and felt it accept that, pressure spreading across her hand and not stabbing down. That mattered. A rope under tension across the wrong medium cut like a wire through cheese. Across the right one, it gripped and shared the load. The mare watched her without whites showing. Phoenix watched the mare more than he watched Claire. That too mattered. Their attention ran through each other. If she earned the mother's steadiness, she'd inherit the colt's. Claire reached for the shorter line first and laid it open on the mud like a smooth question, the loop end nearest Willow's nearer foreleg. She didn't toss. She set. The rope drank water and darkened, its fibers swelling and softening. She inched her weight forward the length of a hand. The basin breathed around them. Far off, a sound like a flag ripping said the leading edge of the next cell had met a line of warmer air and chewed through it. She had minutes to turn this situation into a plan. Phoenix lifted his chin and let it fall till it touched Willow's neck, a tiny, resigned press that said more than any cry. Willow answered with a breath that steadied. Claire, knee-deep in the country's bad math, set her jaw and eased one gloved hand toward the trapped leg, the rope ready to meet it when the mare told her where the limit lived. The storm gathered at her back. The basin waited for the next move. And all the space between one heartbeat and the next stretched long enough to hold a decision. Claire didn't rush the moment. She kept her knees in the mud, weight low, the looped rope resting like a harmless strand of grass between her hands. Willow's ears moved in tiny half-circles, catching the hiss of drizzle, the distant growl of thunder, and the soft scrape of rope fibers shifting. The mare's breathing was still controlled, but Claire could feel the tension in the air. One wrong move and all that focus could tip into panic. She angled her body, letting her eyes drift toward the ground instead of locking on the mare's face. Predators stared. Calm, steady humans did not. She spoke in a low tone, not words so much as a rhythm, something she'd learned years ago with a half-starved stallion that would only stand still if her voice filled the space between them. Her breath puffed white in the cold, mingling with the mist that hugged the basin. From the corner of her eye, she saw Phoenix's head lower slightly, his ears flicking between his mother and this crouched stranger in the mud. He took a single step forward, his hoof making a sticky, sucking sound, and then stopped again, almost as if he realized moving too far might break something invisible. Claire reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. She untied it slowly, letting the scent drift. Alfalfa cubes, dry and sweet, the kind of smell that could cut through rain and fear. She set a few just a couple of feet from her position, their green edges sharp against the brown mud. It was bait, yes, but more than that. It was a signal that not everything coming from her was about pulling or pushing. Some things were simply given. Phoenix stretched his neck toward them, nostrils flaring, but his hooves stayed planted beside Willow. He looked up at her, waiting for some signal, and Willow, despite everything, leaned just enough to touch his withers with her muzzle. It was permission. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, testing the ground with each placement. The mud tried to take his hooves but couldn't hold them. He was light, still free to move where his mother could not. He sniffed the cubes, then picked one up, crunching with quick, decisive bites before stepping back to her side. That little exchange loosened the coil of tension in the air, and Claire moved her rope an inch closer. She eased her gloved fingers along its length until the loop was within reach of Willow's front leg. Her other hand slid into the mud beside the leg, palm up, so the mare could feel the warmth through the cold slurry. The trick was to let Willow decide when the contact happened, not force it. A deep crack of thunder rolled across the basin. The wind carried a sudden scatter of raindrops big enough to sting. Claire's hood flapped against her jaw, and she could see the far wall of the storm moving toward them, dark, heavy, inevitable. Her time was shrinking fast. She shifted her knees for better balance, testing how far she could lean without sinking past her thighs. When Willow's weight shifted slightly backward, Claire took her chance, sliding the loop up over the pastern in one smooth motion. The rope tightened just enough to hold, not enough to bite. Willow's ears twitched, but she didn't lunge. And Claire felt the small victory settle in her chest. She adjusted her stance and dug her boots into the slick slope for leverage. Each pull had to be steady, deliberate. Sudden tugs would waste precious strength and could snap tendons already strained from the struggle. She leaned back, using her own weight to create a gentle, rocking pressure that encouraged Willow to lift her leg rather than fight against the mud's suction. The mare responded with a hesitant shift, her muscles bunching under her slick coat. The sound of suction breaking was subtle but distinct, like tearing wet cloth. Claire let her set the hoof back down on a patch of firmer ground, just inches from where it had been. She reset her grip on the rope, ready to work on the other leg next. But then the first real crack of lightning tore across the sky, so bright it painted the basin white for a blink. The thunder that followed came almost on top of it. A bone-deep boom that made Phoenix flinch and wheel halfway around before running right back to his mother's side. The storm had arrived sooner than she'd hoped, and now every second counted double. Claire fought the urge to speed up. Panic would only make Willow fight the rope, and once an animal decided the thing meant to help was a trap, there was no getting that trust back in the moment. She kept her voice steady, leaning into the storm, her hands working with patient force. She could feel the mud loosening in thin layers, giving back inches that mattered. When she finally freed the second foreleg, Willow took a staggered half step, her hindquarters quivering from the effort. Mud clung high up her legs, thick and dripping, but her eyes, dark, wet, and focused, never left Claire's face now. It was as if she'd accepted the strange human as part of the equation for getting out alive. The wind howled hard enough to rock Claire sideways, but she planted her boots and held steady. The rope was ready for the next pull, the basin's grip weakening by the minute. But so was the weather, and the pounding rain now made every surface more treacherous. If she didn't get Willow free soon, the mud would take back everything she'd just gained. And above them, the sky cracked again, urging her to make the next move before the storm claimed the basin entirely. The second storm didn't arrive so much as drop a curtain. One moment the drizzle stitched a fine gray mesh across the basin. The next, The sky opened and poured a solid sheet of water that erased edges and turned everything into a moving blur. Rain hit with a slap, then a drumbeat, then a roar that swallowed smaller sounds whole. In seconds, Claire's jacket went from damp to soaked, the fabric heavy and cold. The mud around her softened further, slickening from batter to slurry, and the thin skin of water on top thickened into runnels that sought the lowest points with greedy speed. Lightning tore the cloud bank wide open. The flash was so close it bleached the world flat, Willow's chestnut coat going pale, and Phoenix's white star burning like a coin. The thunder that followed rode right on top of it, hitting low and hard, a body blow that made the basin feel like a drum underfoot. Phoenix jumped straight up, the reflex of a body too quick for thought, then landed and swung back to Willow's side, head pressed to her neck as if to anchor himself. His legs trembled in the aftershock, but his hooves found the same small islands of firmer ground he'd memorized in the last hour. Staying was the habit he had perfected, and habits hold when thought fails. Claire widened her stance and dug her boot heels down until she felt the faint resistance of packed clay beneath the sliding surface. The slope tried to push her sideways. She leaned against it. Hips square, weight low, using her own mass as a counter to the rope's pull. Rain pooled on her hood and then fell off in cold sheets that shocked the skin at her collar. Mud climbed her shins with every move, sucking at her boots. Clinging in heavy cuffs, she had to brake with sharp heel lifts before it stole her footing altogether. She reset the rope on Willow's nearer foreleg to a higher angle, threading it over the panel edge to spread the force and keep the line from sawing into soft tissue. The fibers were slick now, saturated and dark, but the rope still took a set under tension. She rocked back with a measured rhythm, counting in her head to keep the pull steady, letting the mare learn the cadence and work with it rather than against it. Rock and give, each cycle loosening a breath width of suction where the mud had sealed itself around bone. Willow answered with effort that came from deeper than muscle. Her hindquarters quivered, not with panic, but with the careful, exhausting control of lifting and holding, of stealing inches from a trap that gave nothing for free. She lifted, set, shifted weight, and lifted again, searching for the exact angle where leverage still existed. When she found it, the sound of release was a thin, tearing thing, almost lost in the rain. Claire felt it through the rope before she heard it. Less drag, more give, the signal to ease before taking again, so the mud wouldn't seize tighter. Water streamed around Willow's hidden legs, swirling as it met the obstruction and fled past in quick, muddy tongues. Bubbles rose, popped, rose again, the basin exhaling through the holes they were forcing in it. The surface gleamed, then dulled as raindrops pockmarked it, then gleamed again when lightning printed its white negative across the land. Claire blinked against grit and water. Mud splashed up at a bad angle, stinging her eyes, smearing her lashes. She wiped with the back of her wrist and blinked until shapes returned. The world had narrowed to rope, legs, and the small triangle of ground she could trust. The wind arrived as a separate event. It came bulging out of the dark like a muscle, a strong, hard push that picked up water and flung it sideways. It shoved at Claire's shoulder with enough force to set her back foot, skidding a half-inch. Then again, trying to reset her center line. She leaned into it, let it pass through her rather than bracing to stop it, and the gust slid over and moved on. The panels rattled. The looped line hummed against their edges. Willow's ears flattened for a heartbeat, then came back to quarters, still dividing their attention between storm and human. Phoenix braced into the wind like a small sail, knees locked, neck low. His tail flagged and then plastered to his rump. The rain flattened his coat and ran in bright rills down the grooves of young muscle. He kept his shoulder against Willow's ribs, finding the same place over and over, the place that meant heartbeat, warmth, the steady metronome of a body that had always heard him and answered. Claire slid a hand into the mud at Willow's knee and combed her fingers through the cold, heavy drag, lifting and shaping channels that would let water slide in and thin the suction where it had clamped hardest. The mud refused at first, then softened under the constant assault of rain and friction. She scooped and pushed as the rope took load, building a narrow trench with her palm and a short-handled rake she pulled from the duffel, teeth biting and releasing, biting and releasing. The work was quick and ugly, but it changed the texture around that leg enough that a timed pull might finally beat the seal. The lightning chased itself across the basin rim, a staggered chain that made the near hillsides shine and the far ones disappear. Claire let the thunder roll and set her count against it, using the seconds in the lull to draw breath and the booms as markers for each lean. Her shoulders burned, her forearms trembled. The cold was a thief, stealing strength from the fingers first, then the wrists, then creeping toward the elbows. She changed her grip to spare tendons she'd need later and kept the rhythm. Rock and give, rock and give. Be predictable. Let the mare lean into the pattern. Willow found the next inch. It took 3 minutes that felt like 30, but she found it, and the rope went slacker for half a beat before Claire caught up and gave her the room. The hoof came free to the fetlock and set in a patch that held. Not much, but it changed the angle. The other foreleg sank a fraction with the new load. Claire shifted the line and repeated the process, framing the leg with her forearms to keep the rope true and off the tendons. Mud swirled and splattered, coating her gloves, filling the creases, turning everything slick. She squeezed until the leather creaked and kept pressure where it belonged. A gust hit hard enough to slam rain into her face like thrown grit. She turned her head, taking the impact on her cheek, and felt the sting run hot. Her eyes watered, not from fear, but from salt and dirt. She blinked again, blinked until the mare's knee returned to focus, until the line was a line again, not a dark smear. The world wobbled at the edge of her vision. She breathed and re-centered. Above the wind's ragged edge, the storm spoke in one long, tearing crack that felt like it split the air itself. Phoenix flattened, then rose, then flattened again, a small metronome of nerves giving way to habit. The basin filled. The shallow runnels that had been lines were now fingers, then hands, then a broad, shallow flow that found Claire's knees and tried to push her down the slope by increments. She set her shins against a panel leg and used it as a brace, a small, stubborn anchor. Her thighs burned, her toes cramped inside cold boots. She ignored the catalog of discomfort and watched the mare breathe. Another cycle, another half-inch. Willow's chest lifted out of the mud and slammed back in as the suction held like a bad promise. Claire felt her own jaw clench and made herself let it go. Tension flared and traveled whether you meant it to or not. She breathed from the diaphragm and counted again. Phoenix reached across and touched Willow's withers with his mouth, a tiny, anchoring contact. Willow's ear flicked to him and returned to Claire. Their triangle held. The rope jerked and slid. Claire let it, easing to keep the pressure constant rather than fighting the slip. She shifted hand over hand, reset the lead through the panel notch, and felt the texture at Willow's knee change in her grip. The mud beneath had gone from glue to thick soup. That was her opening. She leaned all the way back, hips below knees, spine stacked, and took one long, even pull that was more lift than drag. Willow answered with everything she had left, shoulders rising, neck stretching, nostrils flaring wide enough to drink the whole storm. Something gave. Not the leg, never the leg, the mud. It ripped with a wet sigh, the kind that carries relief and warning in the same breath. Willow surged forward a single clumsy step and held. The basin, offended by the theft, tried to take her back, closing around the holes. Claire was faster. She darted the rope higher, reset her stance, and dug her boots down till her arches screamed. The rain pounded the world flat. The wind pressed. The lightning wrote hard angles across the gray. In the middle of it, on a slope that wanted to erase them, a woman set herself against the pull of earth, and a mare met her with the last of her precision. Between them, a colt breathed in the rhythm they made and stayed put. The second storm had come to finish what the first had started. Claire worked as if there was no other time than now, no other choice than forward, no other world than rope, breath, and the next inch they could wrest from the basin before it took everything back. Willow's lunge had cost her more than it gave. The single step forward stole the last solid platform beneath her hind legs, forcing her to catch herself in a half-collapsed crouch. Claire saw the shift immediately, the trembling in the haunches, the way the left foreleg buckled inward before locking again, the flash of pain in the mare's eyes that even rain couldn't wash away. Claire dropped the rope for a breath, letting it rest slack so the mare wouldn't waste strength fighting its pull. She knelt, one knee sinking into the cold slurry, and ran her hand along Willow's shoulder and down the leg as far as the mud allowed. Even without seeing the joint, she could feel the unnatural rotation, the swelling that was already building. Her stomach sank. This wasn't just exhaustion or strain. Something inside had given way. Phoenix shifted closer, almost stepping onto Claire's boot in his urgency to be beside his mother. His flanks rose and fell in quick bursts, his damp coat twitching against the relentless rain. He didn't understand the mechanics of injury, but he understood that Willow's balance had changed, that her movements were no longer the purposeful, controlled ones she'd been making before. Claire lifted her eyes toward the basin's rim. The water was still rising, but it would be minutes before it became a true flood. The storm's roar muffled the finer sounds of injury, but she didn't need her ears to know how bad it was. She'd seen this before, sometimes in rodeo horses brought to her too late, sometimes in the wild ones trapped after a fall. There were certain breaks you couldn't splint, certain tears you couldn't stitch. And out here, in this wet, sucking ground, there was no version of getting Willow on her feet and walking her out without making that pain unbearable. She sat back on her heels for a moment, rain coursing down her hood, and let herself look at the mare the way she looked at her own rescues in the barn, directly, without pretending the situation was something it wasn't. Willow's eyes met hers, dark, clear, present, and tired in the way a body is when it has given all it has to give. Her hand went to the duffel almost automatically, fingers finding the waterproof roll where she kept the most serious tools of her trade. Inside, tucked between gauze and a spare syringe, was the vial she carried for moments like this. Moments she never wanted to use it, but always carried it for. The weight of it in her palm felt heavier than any rope. Phoenix pressed his muzzle to Willow's jaw, letting out a small, broken whicker that barely reached Claire over the rein. She swallowed hard and pushed herself upright, wading the last step into Willow's space. One hand found the mare's damp neck, stroking along the line where muscle met mane. She leaned close, letting her voice thread through the storm in a low, steady murmur. "You did everything you could," she said, not for her own comfort, but because she believed some part of the mare might understand the tone, if not the words. She prepped the syringe with movements that were as much habit as thought, shielding it from the rain with her body. Willow stood still, her breathing even now, as if the fight had already left her. Claire's free hand rested on the mare's withers, feeling the slow, strong pulse there. When the needle slid in, Willow didn't flinch. Claire kept talking, her voice carrying the rhythm she'd used before, not coaxing now, but closing, easing the mare toward the one thing she could offer: peace. Phoenix shifted uneasily, ears flicking forward and back, his young instincts warning him something irreversible was happening. Claire didn't shoo him away. She let him stay, let him press his head into Willow's shoulder until the mare's knees softened. The rain quieted for a strange moment, as if the storm itself had paused. Willow exhaled once, long and slow, her body sinking into the mud with a softness that had nothing to do with exhaustion now. Claire kept her hand on the mare's neck until there was no more breath. No more flick of ear or twitch of muscle, just stillness and the steady hiss of rain returning to fill the silence. Phoenix made a sound then, a high, sharp cry that cut through the basin and bounced off its wet walls. It was raw, confused, searching. He stepped toward Willow's head, nudging at her jaw as though trying to wake her. Claire stayed where she was, rain streaming down her face, the rope lying limp and useless beside her. She had learned long ago that there was no quick way to pull a young one out of this kind of moment. The colt needed to know, in his own way, that she wasn't getting back up. After a minute that felt much longer, Claire eased forward and set her palm against Phoenix's shoulder. He flinched, then stilled, his gaze never leaving Willow. She gave him the time he needed before slipping the halter from her kit and looping it gently over his neck. It wasn't restraint so much as a guide, a way to lead him without forcing him. "Come on, boy," she said softly, though the words were mostly for her own sake. He resisted at first, pulling back toward Willow's still form, but Claire was patient, keeping the rope slack, giving him a step, then a pause, then another. Eventually, his hooves began to follow hers, one at a time, away from the spot where the mud had claimed his mother. The rain masked the sound of each step, but she felt them through the line, light and hesitant, the weight of grief in each one. By the time they reached the slope, the wind had shifted again, carrying the smell of sage and wet earth up from the flats. Phoenix stopped once more, turning his head to look back. Claire let him, her own chest tight. Then she gave the rope the faintest tug, and together they climbed out of the basin, leaving behind the mare who had stood her ground against the storm until she couldn't anymore. Behind them, the rain kept falling, erasing the tracks almost as quickly as they were made. Thunder moved off by degrees, not like an apology, but a reminder. The storm had other business down the valley. In its wake came the steadier sounds, the hiss of rain on sage, the soft churn of runoff finding the easiest path, the slow settling of mud where bodies had struggled. Claire stayed a moment longer with her hand on Willow's neck, counting beats that weren't there to count. The mare's heat faded under her palm, not fast and not slow, just inevitable. Phoenix stood with his chin pressed to Willow's jaw until the weight no longer answered him, then lifted his head and stared, as if the shape might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. The decision had been made minutes earlier, but it kept arriving in waves. It arrived when Claire capped the empty syringe with fingers that didn't quite obey. It arrived when she slid the vial back into the roll and felt the ugly lightness of an unused cure-all. It arrived when her knees protested as she stood and the mud let go of her shins with a sound like regret. "I promised." She reminded the dark, not looking for witness, just setting a line she could follow out of the basin. She had promised the mare she would see to the colt. Now the rest of the job began. She radioed Rick on Channel 6, the handheld speaker crackling in the damp. Words were kept simple. Mare down, colt alive, bad leg, no salvage. Need a rig later to recover the body before coyotes got there first, and before the water took her somewhere no one could reach. Rick's answer rode the static. He'd bring the ranch tractor after the cell line passed, maybe with a chain cradle if the ground would bear it. He said he was sorry, the way men who worked this land said sorry, straightforward, without asking for a reply. Claire propped one of the portable panels on the highest part of the shoulder and dragged the other to meet it, making a small, open corner that could serve as a catch pen if Phoenix found panic at the last minute. The panels wrapped and shifted until she wedged them with a rock and the heel of her boot. She walked back down the slope, not avoiding the body, not stepping on it either, tracing a path that would be safe for a foal's light hooves and uncertain mind. Phoenix had not moved. The halter hung loose at his neck, the lead slack in the mud. He watched Claire approach and then looked back at Willow, eyes too old for his short life. Grief makes a body strange. It can freeze a colt in place or fling him in a blind scramble. She kept everything slow, the bend of her knees, the angle of her shoulders, the touch that started at the withers, the safe place, and slid forward. The blanket from the duffel came around his back like a second hide. He flinched at the first brush, then stood still as the warmth settled and the rain found a new path down his sides. The loading would have to wait until they were out of the bowl and on firm ground. First, she had to build a routine where routine no longer existed. She set the lead in her hand like a suggestion rather than an order, a step, a pause, her weight shifting backward, inviting his to follow. Phoenix resisted the line, not with a jerk, but with the steady pull of a heart that knew where it wanted to be. He leaned toward Willow, ears flicked back, then forward again. Claire gave him the rope to make the choice and filled the space with her presence. A quiet, immovable fact next to the louder one he didn't want to accept. He lifted a hoof and set it down exactly where hers had been a heartbeat earlier. Good. She praised him with breath rather than voice, a small exhale he could feel through the lead. Another step. Mud sighed and let him go. At the rim, the pen waited, open on one side like a question with an obvious answer. He walked into the angle without seeing the geometry of it, turned, and faced downslope. Claire closed the gap with the second panel and set the pin. Not a prison, just a pause button. The blanket reached lower this time, tucked under his chest and cinched behind the withers with a strap so it wouldn't slip when he moved. The rain eased, as if the sky was tired of its own weight. The world took on edges again. On the far ridge, the truck's dull shape sharpened. Claire wiped her face with the back of a muddy wrist and tasted grit. Her throat burned in that way it did after bad jobs, like she'd breathed smoke though nothing had been on fire but muscle and will. She went back for Willow then, because leaving a body alone while there was still work to be done felt wrong. She didn't do much. There was not much to do. She cleared the mare's face of mud with the cleanest corner of a rag, smoothed the forelock back, and set a length of tarp over the barrel to keep scavengers and rain from taking at her until Rick could bring the tractor. The tarp wasn't big enough to cover everything, and the wind tried to lift it. She weighted it with her duffel on one edge and a stone on the other. It would hold for an hour. It would have to. A small blue tag hung from her keyring for times like this. A dog-eared BLM contact number and her own ID scrawled in permanent marker. She snapped a picture of the basin and the body with her phone, noting the coordinates that stamped themselves in the corner of the screen. The paperwork mattered. The respect mattered more. She whispered a simple thanks to the empty space because saying it grounded her. The mare had done everything right, kept her colt close, saved her power for the pulls that mattered, stood until standing could not be done. Motherhood, written in muscle and decision. When she turned back, Phoenix had his nose lifted to catch the wind. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, sage and wet dirt, old grass and iron. He called once, a smaller sound than before, and waited. Claire opened the panel, stood to the side of the gap, and let him choose. He stepped toward her with the blanket shifting in small waves along his back, the lead line whispering between her glove and the ring. The trailer sat on higher ground, like a promise she wasn't sure he would accept yet. She walked him that way by arcs, not straight lines, giving him the dignity of looking back as many times as he needed. Each time he looked, she paused. Each time he returned his attention, she moved. At the truck, she dropped the ramp and listened for the hollow thud that said it set square. The world beyond the ramp was new. Rubber mats instead of mud, aluminum walls instead of open basin, hay net instead of the endless pick of prairie grass. New was hard on a day like this. New was also the only way forward. She gathered the lead, checked the strap on the blanket, and let her palm rest a moment between his eyes. Promise again without the word. She had ended one life because mercy demanded it. Now she would have to make good on the other half of the choice. Keep this one going. The hardest decision didn't end with a needle. It bled into every minute that followed. 1,000 small choices stitched together until they held. Claire breathed, squared herself to the ramp, and began the careful, patient work of asking a wild-born colt to step into the dark and trust that he would step out again. The ramp thudded under Phoenix's first tentative hoof, the hollow sound making his ears snap forward in sharp surprise. He froze, eyes wide, body leaning back toward the safety of open ground. Claire didn't tighten the lead. She knew the moment she pulled, his instinct would be to resist harder. Instead, she shifted sideways, easing the angle of the rope so it drew him toward her without force. The blanket on his back shifted with the motion, releasing the scent of wool and hay. Claire let him breathe it in, one step at a time. She tapped the trailer's side panel lightly with her free hand, the rhythmic pat-pat echoing in the small space, a sound she'd used with nervous rescues before. Predictable noises meant the world wasn't about to explode. She backed up a single pace inside the trailer, leaving the lead slack between them, and waited. Phoenix took the ramp in 2 halting steps, then stopped again. His head swung sideways to look past her, searching for Willow as if she might be standing just out of sight. Claire felt the pang of it deep in her chest. She didn't speak. Words wouldn't bridge what he was looking for. Instead, she lowered her gaze and turned her body slightly toward the hay net hanging inside. The green sweetness drifted in the damp air. Curiosity and hunger, small but persistent, finally moved him forward. His hooves landed on the rubber mats with soft, dull thumps, his nostrils flaring as he tested the new scent. Claire stepped aside so he could explore the length of the trailer without feeling cornered. He circled once, sniffed the walls, and finally pulled a mouthful of hay free. Only when his head was down and chewing did she lift the ramp and secure it, the latch clicking into place. The drive back to the rescue ranch was slow. The roads were slick, the truck's tires sending up muddy fans behind them. The storm trailed them for a while, the wipers dragging across the windshield in a steady beat. Claire glanced in the rearview mirror more than she needed to, checking the small shape shifting inside the trailer. Each time she caught sight of him, he was still chewing, his head bobbing slightly with the truck's motion. By the time they pulled into the ranch yard, the sky had begun to pale in the east. A thin band of silver cutting into the dark. The barn lights glowed warm against the wet, the smell of damp earth and horses greeting her like something that had been waiting all night. She backed the trailer up to the open barn doors, the beeping echoing in the quiet, and dropped the ramp. Phoenix stood at the far end, watching. He didn't bolt when she stepped inside, but his ears flicked at every sound. The creak of the ramp, the shift of the trailer springs, the rustle of hay outside. Claire unhooked the lead from his halter, but kept the line looped loosely around his neck, just in case he decided to test his new freedom. The stall she'd prepared was at the end of the main aisle, roomy and bedded deep with fresh shavings. She'd hung another hay net and filled the corner bucket with warm water from the tap. But the most important part of the setup stood in the next stall. Luna, a retired mare with a dapple gray coat and eyes that had seen enough storms to know when calm was needed. Claire led Phoenix into the stall, her boots muffled by the shavings. He paused just inside, nose working furiously as the new smells hit him. Wood, hay, the faint metallic tang of the water bucket, and the stronger, living scent of the mare next door. Luna stepped forward, her head lifting over the half door, ears forward but relaxed. She gave a soft woof, the kind of greeting that asked nothing in return. Phoenix froze for half a breath, then stepped toward her. Their noses touched, the colt's tentative and quick, the mare's slow and deliberate. She sniffed him once more, then pulled back, blinking slowly as if to say, "You're fine here." It was enough. Phoenix lowered his head and began to nibble at the hay, the tension in his shoulders easing fractionally. Claire leaned on the stall door for a moment, letting the scene settle in her bones. She'd seen enough introductions to know this one had gone as well as she could have hoped. Some horses rejected newcomers outright, others ignored them completely. But Luna had stepped in with quiet acceptance, and Phoenix had answered with trust, however fragile. She left them to it, heading down the aisle to check the other rescues. Most of them were still half asleep, shifting in their stalls or watching her with mild interest. The routine of feeding and checking water felt almost strange after the night's chaos, the simple tasks grounding her in a way she didn't realize she needed. When she returned to Phoenix's stall, Luna was standing with her head turned toward him, their bodies parallel on either side of the wall. He had finished half the hay and was nosing at the water bucket, whiskers breaking the surface in tiny ripples. She unlatched the door and stepped inside, crouching slightly to make her shape less imposing. Phoenix flicked an ear toward her but didn't move away. She spoke softly, just enough to fill the air with the sound of her voice, and reached out to brush her fingertips along his shoulder. The blanket was still warm under her hand. His skin twitched once, then stilled. She let the contact last a moment before stepping back, leaving him the space to decide what came next. The sun had not yet risen, but the first pale light made the barn aisle glow in muted gold. Claire pulled the stall door shut behind her and stood for a moment, listening to the rustle of hay, the slow rhythm of horses breathing, the occasional stamp of a hoof. Phoenix was safe for the night, and that was enough, for now. She knew the next days would bring their own challenges, teaching him to take a halter willingly, to follow a lead without fear, to trust a hand that reached for him. But as she watched him lean slightly toward Luna, eyes half-lidded, she allowed herself a rare moment of relief. The storm had taken much, but it had left him, and that was something she could build on. Weeks blurred into a pattern that made sense only when stacked side by side. Feed, water, check the legs, brush the coat, teach the small things that became larger things. Phoenix learned the barn's rhythms the way a song becomes familiar, first as noise, then as a beat, then as something you can move to without thinking. Morning light came thin and blue over the plains, sliding down the barn aisle until it found his stall. The air held the clean scent of pine shavings and that warm, sweet hay note that meant safety. Luna stood in the next stall like a steady landmark. He measured himself against her calm. At first he slept in short, jittery stretches, chin tucked, knees locked, the kind of rest a prey animal takes when his body isn't convinced the ground will hold him. Each time a wind gust rattled the tin or the swallows scissored along the rafters, he sprang up and stood fixed, ears searching. The blanket helped, a small, portable warmth that tricked his muscles into releasing. So did Luna's breath through the half door, a slow, even tide. After 3 nights, his naps lengthened. After a week, he woke without the startle, blinking instead, and the blink held. Claire kept the work simple, a halter on and off without rush, a lead draped like a suggestion, not a demand. Touch where touch would matter later, shoulder, withers, knees, fingers pausing, retreating, returning. She broke the days into wins a body could recognize. A mouthful of soaked pellets taken from a shallow pan, a step onto the mat by the wash rack, a longer stand tied short to the ring with a breakaway loop. She kept her voice low and spare. Most of her conversation happened with the position of her shoulders and the steadiness of her breath. Outside, the high plains shook off winter in fits. The snow held on in dirty islands under the north fences, while the south-facing slope greened in a wash of early grass. Mud dried at the edges first, leaving a soft, cakey crust that cracked under a hoof and threw dust puffs when the sun ran high. The wind didn't stop, but it softened around the middle of the day. And in that gentler hour, Claire turned Phoenix into the small paddock and let him discover how a body moves when it isn't measuring every step. At first, he didn't move much at all. He stood near the gate, head high, nostrils flaring at the outdoor smells that were not the basin's. Sun-warmed wood, old manure turned to powder, the faint iron tang from the trough. Luna walked the fence line on her side, a gray escort shadowing his indecision. When Phoenix finally took a tentative trot along the rail, she matched him, and his stride lengthened in answer. His tail rose and flagged for 3 strides, then dropped. The next day it stayed up for 5. Word traveled the way it does in small places. A picture on the rescue's bulletin board became 2 on a local Facebook group. The story of a mare that chose to hold her ground and a colt that chose to stay where love told him to stay found sympathetic hands. A feed store slipped a bag of full ration onto Claire's invoice and then marked the total down anyway. A retired vet dropped off powdered milk replacer just in case and spared a few minutes to look Phoenix over without making a production of it. Claire accepted the help with a nod and a half smile that said thank you, and also I'll make it count. Volunteers came on Saturdays, teenagers with careful hands and older women with the practical grace of people who had raised children and stock and knew the difference between fussing and tending. They mucked, stacked hay, coiled hoses, and stood quietly at Phoenix's stall to give him the skill that is harder than any trick. Being with a creature without asking it to perform. He learned their shapes as background rather than threat. He learned that a ladder scraping the wall meant maintenance, not chase. A wheelbarrow meant work, not pursuit. Not everything moved forward in straight lines. One afternoon, a tarp slipped from a nail in the breezeway and snapped loud enough in the wind to mimic a predator's lunge. Phoenix spun so fast his hind hooves kissed the board and left twin chalk marks. He didn't go through the air. He rebounded in place, wildness flashing up like a spark from old coals. Claire was there in 2 steps, not to seize but to set a boundary with her body. Shoulders squared, palms open, breath slow. Luna's head came up, ears sharp. The stall line held. The moment passed through them. Phoenix stood and breathed until his eyes softened again. Claire rehung the tarp and left it to flap gently while she brushed Luna, letting the sound become the kind of nuisance a mind can file under ordinary. He grew. It happened too slowly for a single day to name, but the tape measure told the truth each week. The star on his forehead seemed smaller simply because the face it lit had broadened. The full ribs rounded under a gloss that said nutrition and ease. The odd, coltish angles of knee and hip smoothed. He discovered the pleasure of a currycomb along the crest and the itchy place at the base of his mane that a human hand could reach better than a fence post. He learned to lower his head when the halter came and to send it toward the loop, because that made the moment end sooner and with a rub at the jaw hinge that felt good. Luna shifted from neighbor to mentor without fuss. When Phoenix balked at a puddle on the way to the paddock, she stepped into it and stood until he splashed through. When he pranced because the wind brought a new scent from the highway, she grazed with exaggerated slowness until ground-level information drowned out whatever his imagination had invented. At night they dozed in mirror positions, each one's breath answering the other's in low, even waves. Near the end of the second week, Claire opened the far gate and let Phoenix watch the other rescues move in their larger field. They were a mismatched bunch. A rangy roan with a permanent hitch from a long-ago trailer wreck, a bay with a Roman nose and the patience of a saint, 2 ponies who worked out their differences daily with pinned ears and 10-yard sprints, a mule who ignored everyone on principle. Phoenix's ears flicked at each new shape. Curiosity pulled at him like a soft rope. He didn't call. He watched. By the 3rd week, the lead meant something more than suggestion. Claire added a small ask. Yield the hindquarters on a light touch at the rib. The first try was a shuffle and a confused look. The 5th try was a clean step under with the inside hind and a release that turned his whole neck soft. She took the win, rubbed the withers, and put him away before the work turned stale. She saved his best try for last, so the barn smelled like victory to him when the day ended. Donations paid for a vet recheck. The x-rays said what Claire's hands already knew. Phoenix had come through the basin without damage beyond the kind that doesn't show on film. Stress lives in muscle and mind. The vet left muscle rub and advice as practical as dirt. Keep him moving, keep him thinking, Keep your expectations reasonable and your standards consistent. On a morning rinsed clean by a light overnight rain, Claire led Phoenix into the round pen for the first time. No lunge line, no whip. Just a space where a body could explore answers without the world crowding in. He trotted, stopped, turned into her without being taught the cue because every day for 3 weeks had been a slow accumulation of the same question and answer. Are you with me? Yes. He moved off when she breathed out and matched her arc when she moved her shoulder. It wasn't training so much as conversation with legs. When she stepped to the center and stilled, he walked up and set his chin lightly on the place between her shoulder and collarbone, where humans lean when they're tired. She let him be heavy for a count of 5. Then she sent him away again, because independence would be as important to his future as trust. By the end of the 4th week, the paddock no longer contained all his energy. He tested his length against the fence line and found the kind of stride that skims ground. The first true gallop took him from the gate to the far corner in a few heartbeats. Tail flagged, neck arched, hooves drumming a rhythm that made Luna prick her ears and canter just for the pleasure of being asked. He skidded to a stop too close to the rail, flung his nose and bucked once, awkward but honest, a colt remembering he was built for more than survival. Claire watched from the fence with a coffee gone cold in her hand. The weeks had left their marks on her, bruises yellowing to the kind of green that only horse people notice, a cut across the knuckles from a careless snap, the deep, bone-deep fatigue that sits under the ribs and makes sleep more necessary than it is possible. But when Phoenix turned at the far end and came back in a long, ground-eating lope, ears forward, eye bright, the heaviness shifted. The ranch sounded like itself again, a gate chain clinking, swallows stitching the air, Luna's steady snort. The storm lived in the past as scars live under hair, gone from view, never entirely gone. What remained was the daily making of a life that could hold both memory and motion. When Phoenix slowed and dropped to a walk, he drifted to the fence and stood with his chest against the top rail, breath pushing warm through the slats. Claire set her palm on his forehead, over the small white star that had not changed at all. It felt like a promise she could finally imagine keeping. Tomorrow would ask for more. He would have it to give. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into the kind of warm, slow rhythm that makes even the wind seem lazy. The pastures were a patchwork of deep green and gold, the early grass giving way to sun-cured hay under a sky that stayed wide and blue most days. Phoenix had traded the angular lines of a rescued foal for the balanced frame of a young Mustang, his muscles smooth under a coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight. The star on his forehead still caught the light, flashing white each time he tossed his head in play. Claire stood at the pasture gate most evenings now, coffee cooling in her hands, watching him run with Luna in the open field. What had once been tentative, stiff-legged movement was now fluid and sure. Long, rolling strides that skimmed the ground as if he were born to race the horizon. Luna stayed near him, matching his pace when he wanted company and letting him surge ahead when the need to lead overtook him. On this particular evening, the sky was tipping toward sunset, the sun laying its gold across the ridge and lighting the tops of the cottonwoods. A faint breeze carried the smell of sage from the hills, a scent Claire always thought of as Wyoming's signature. Phoenix and Luna moved together along the fence line, their tails flicking in rhythm. When they reached the far corner, Phoenix broke into a gallop, the wind catching his mane, Luna letting him go as if to remind him that freedom was part of his inheritance. Claire leaned on the fence rail, the rough wood warm under her forearms, and let herself think about the first time she'd seen him. Small, pressed against his mother's side in the sucking mud, the storm rolling in heavy and fast. Willow's eyes had been sharp even in exhaustion, her stance unyielding despite the trap. That image had stayed with her, carved deep. The reminder that love sometimes meant standing in the hardest place without moving. In the weeks since Phoenix's arrival, the story had made its way through the local community. People stopped by with bags of feed, offered to muck stalls, or dropped envelopes with folded bills and short notes. For the colt, for Willow's son. A reporter from the regional paper had come out to take pictures and write about the rescue ranch, but Claire had steered the interview toward the horses rather than herself. She talked about the Mustangs still running on public lands, the ones pulled off for adoption, and the ones that never got the chance. Phoenix's picture had run beside Luna's, the caption calling them unlikely family. That was what they had become. Luna, who had come to the ranch years ago with her own quiet scars, had taken to Phoenix without hesitation. She let him eat from her pile until Claire made sure he had his own. She blocked other horses from crowding him, her body an easy wall of gray. At night, they stood hip to hip under the lean-to, their breathing blending into one sound. It wasn't motherhood exactly, but it was enough. Claire had kept her promise. Phoenix was healthy, gaining weight and confidence, and still carrying that spark of the wild that made him more than just another horse in a pasture. She hadn't broken him, hadn't even started saddle work yet. There was no rush. He would grow into his strength, learn what he needed to know, and the rest would come when the time was right. For now, his education was in the language of trust, leading without pulling, standing tied without fuss, lifting his hooves for the farrier without the whites of his eyes showing. As the sun slid lower, Phoenix slowed from his gallop to a trot, then a walk, finally stopping near the gate where Claire stood. He reached his nose over the top rail, breathing warm against her wrist. She let her fingers find the spot just behind his jaw, where the skin was softest, scratching gently until his eyes half closed. Luna came up behind him, resting her chin briefly on his withers before stepping aside to graze. The air cooled with the fading light. In the distance, a hawk wheeled high, its cry cutting clean through the quiet. Claire thought of Willow again, how she had stood in that basin, unmoving in the face of the storm, and how Phoenix had chosen to stay beside her when escape had been possible. That choice, made in the first weeks of his life, had carried forward into everything since. He had stayed when trust was offered. He had learned that staying could mean safety, and that safety could mean room to grow. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the fence post, taking a last long look at him in the fading light. Phoenix turned his head toward the pasture, ears pricked toward some small sound only he could hear. Then, as if deciding he had time for both curiosity and connection, he stepped closer and pressed his forehead briefly to her chest before turning away again. The contact was fleeting, but it landed like a promise kept on both sides. Claire watched him rejoin Luna, the two of them moving off toward the far end of the field as the sky deepened from gold to rose to the first hint of blue shadow. The rescue ranch was quiet now, the work of the day done. She knew there would be more storms ahead. There always were. But tonight the air was still, the fences were sound, and the horses under her care were safe. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on. It's letting go enough for the ones you protect to find their own ground. Willow had given Phoenix that, even in her last moments. Now it was Claire's turn to do the same, one day at a time, until the colt she'd promised to care for was no longer a colt, but a Mustang strong enough to run as far and as free as he chose.